Walter Grady stood silently in the quiet of his front yard, staring at the letter that had arrived that morning. His hands, weathered by years of labor, trembled as he unfolded the thick envelope. It was official, his worst fears had been realized. The Homeowners Association, led by Nancy Whitmore, the woman who had been trying to control every aspect of his life for months, had slapped him with a $50,000 fine. He scanned the letter, each word sinking deeper into his chest. Violation of neighborhood standards, it said. The reason? His fence. The very same fence that had stood for over half a century, built by his father. To make matters worse, the HOA threatened foreclosure on his property if the fine wasn't paid in full within 30 days. Walter's fists clenched. He had seen it coming, the letters had started months ago. Petty complaints about his old fence, his slightly overgrown lawn, and his worn-out barn. He had ignored them all, assuming they were just part of the HOA's obsessive control tactics. But this? This was different. A $50,000 fine was not something a man living on a fixed income could easily brush off, especially not after the death of his wife 2 years ago. Yet, it wasn't just the money. No, this was about something much deeper, about Nancy Whitmore and the HOA's audacity. They had tested him for months, probing to see how far they could push him before he broke. They believed that they could control him, that he was just an old man, a relic of the past, who wouldn't fight back. But they were wrong. Walter had something they never expected. He had power. He had knowledge of a secret that could cripple them. Walter Grady wasn't just some retiree living quietly in the outskirts of Woodland Pines. He was the owner of the only road that led into the neighborhood. The HOA, eager to develop the area, had neglected to ask who owned the access road, assuming it was just a public road. But Walter's father had ensured that the deed to the road remained in the family when they sold the land to the developers back in the 1970s. The road was his, privately owned but open for public use. For years, Walter had let the HOA and the residents think it was a public road, a simple part of the neighborhood's infrastructure. That had been their mistake. They didn't know that Walter Grady held the key to the entire neighborhood. And now, standing in his front yard as the sun dipped low in the sky, he knew it was time to take action. He crumpled the letter in his hand and tossed it into the trash bin. There would be no compliance, no payment. He wasn't going to sit back and let Nancy Whitmore and her cronies ruin his life any longer. Walter walked calmly toward the shed in his backyard, where his tools rested, tools ready for the task ahead. It was time to remind the HOA just who had control over Woodland Pines. They wouldn't get away with this. Not now. For years, Walter had lived a simple life, content in his solitude after the death of his wife. The house, the yard, the barn, each part of his property held memories of a peaceful life. But peace had not lasted long with the HOA breathing down his neck. At first, it had seemed harmless. A letter demanding he repaint his fence. It had faded, they said, and didn't meet their aesthetic standards. Walter had chuckled, tossing it aside. But then came more letters, requests that were slowly becoming demands. The fines started small, a few hundred here and there for minor violations. A $500 penalty for not replacing a mailbox to fit their style. A $1,000 fine for a tree branch that hung too low over the sidewalk. But as the weeks passed, the fines grew larger, more aggressive. The HOA wasn't just concerned about the aesthetics of the neighborhood, they wanted control, dictating every little detail of how people lived. Walter had ignored it all. He wasn't one for confrontation, and he never had asked for any of these ridiculous rules. But this latest letter? This was different. A $50,000 fine for failing to meet their standards on a fence that had been standing for over 50 years. The letter threatened to foreclose on his property if the fine wasn't paid. Walter's rage grew with each word he read. They think I'm just some old man they can push around, he muttered to himself, seething with anger. They have no idea who they're messing with. This time, it wasn't about the money. It was personal. The HOA had crossed a line, testing his limits to see how far they could push. But what they didn't know was that Walter had something they couldn't control. Something they had overlooked for decades. Walter wasn't just a retired engineer. He wasn't just an elderly man living alone in a rundown house. He was the owner of the only road leading into Woodland Pines. Since the 1970s, when his father sold most of the land, Walter had held on to the deed for the access road. It wasn't a public road. It never had been. And now the HOA was about to learn that their fate depended on Walter's goodwill. The HOA had assumed that everyone in Woodland Pines was bound by the same rules, but Walter's history with the land gave him leverage they never expected. It wasn't just a fine over a fence. This was about power, and Walter wasn't going to let them strip him of it. Over the next few days, Walter gathered his documents, the deed to the road, his father's original land agreement from 1974, the maps, and legal paperwork. He knew the HOA would fight back. They would try to intimidate him, but Walter was prepared. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting to set a precedent. The people in the neighborhood needed to know that they didn't have to live under the thumb of the HOA. Walter contacted an old friend, David, a lawyer who had once been one of his students when he worked as an engineer. David had become a respected attorney, specializing in property and land law. When they met, David was shocked. "Wait a minute. You mean to tell me the whole neighborhood has been using this road for decades, and no one bothered to ask who owns it?" Walter nodded. "That's right. They thought it was public, but it was never theirs. It's mine. And now they're trying to take me to court over a fence. They don't know who they're messing with." David grinned. "Well, Walter, this is going to get interesting. Let's make sure they understand exactly who's in charge here." As David worked on compiling the legal documents, Walter prepared for what was to come. He never wanted to escalate things into a legal battle, but he knew he couldn't back down. This wasn't just about a fine anymore, it was about making the HOA understand that they couldn't control him. He wanted to send a message to the neighborhood that they didn't have to comply with these petty rules. Tensions in Woodland Pines grew as Nancy Whitmore, the HOA president, ramped up her efforts to force Walter to comply. She sent letters, made phone calls, and even enlisted local authorities to help her pressure him. But each attempt to corner Walter only pushed him further into action. The more the HOA tried to control him, the more determined he became. Then, one afternoon, while Walter was tending to his garden, a black SUV pulled up to his driveway. Two men in uniform stepped out, HOA enforcement officers. They were hired muscle, sent by Nancy to intimidate him. They weren't there to discuss legalities, they were there to make sure Walter knew that the HOA wasn't going to back down. One of the officers, a bulky man with tattoos snaking up his neck, walked up to Walter with a smug smile. "Mr. Grady," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "We're here to inspect your property. The HOA has made it clear that you failed to meet our standards." Walter's grip on the shovel in his hand tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not interested in your inspection," he said calmly. "You don't have permission to be here." The officer's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Walter could feel the tension thickening in the air, but he stood firm. This was only the beginning. The HOA had made a serious mistake, and now, Walter Grady was about to show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a man who has something they need. "You're going to regret this, old man," one of them muttered as he turned away. "Don't say we didn't warn you." With that, he and his partner retreated to their SUV, leaving Walter standing in his yard, fuming with anger but determined to stand his ground. What they didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. In the following days, the Homeowners Association, HOA, escalated their campaign against him, and Nancy Whitmore, in particular, was no longer satisfied with just sending threatening letters. She was intent on making his life unbearable. The first strike came in the form of a crew that appeared without warning. They came to tear down the wooden fence Walter's father had built decades ago, claiming it was a safety hazard. Without any permission or consultation, they bulldozed part of it, leaving a chaotic mess of splintered wood, broken posts, and debris scattered across Walter's yard. When Walter found out, he was livid. He immediately contacted his lawyer, David, and the two of them began preparing to take legal action against the HOA. But the damage had been done. The HOA had made the first move, and it was clear they weren't going to stop until Walter had been thoroughly broken. Then came the cruelest blow of all. One night, Walter's aging golden retriever, Daisy, vanished without a trace. Daisy had been a part of his life for years, and Walter immediately began searching the property, calling out her name in desperation. But by the time morning came, there was still no sign of her. The following day, a neighbor called him, sounding uneasy. "Walter, I think you need to come over here," she said. "Last night I saw a van pull up, and this morning, I found Daisy locked in the back of it. She's fine, but you need to see this." When Walter arrived at his neighbor's house, he was horrified. Daisy was safe, but she wasn't alone. The neighbor's yard was filled with other missing pets, dogs, cats, even rabbits, locked in the van. Walter's stomach churned with fury. He knew right away that the HOA was behind this. They were taking things to a personal level now, and it was clear that they were willing to go to any lengths to make his life hell. It wasn't about property rules anymore, it was about control. Walter immediately contacted the authorities, but the police couldn't find any solid evidence. The HOA had covered its tracks well, and there was little they could do. But Walter knew exactly who was behind it. And he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Then came the final straw. One afternoon, Walter was sitting on his porch when a utility truck emblazoned with the HOA's logo pulled up. A crew of workers began unloading equipment, and Walter's heart sank as he realized what they were there to do. They were about to cut off his power. Walter stormed outside, fury evident in his voice. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "We've been instructed to shut off your electricity and water, Mr. Grady," the lead worker replied, his tone cold and unbothered. "Until you comply with the HOA's demands, this is the first step." Walter's blood boiled. This was a step too far. They were threatening to take away his basic utilities, his power, his water, just because he refused to bow to their rules. His hands trembled with rage, but he knew he couldn't back down. This time, he was going to fight back. Without another word, Walter turned and headed toward his shed. With years of experience and a deep breath, he grabbed a heavy wrench and made his way to the meter box. He wasn't about to let the HOA have their way. In a few swift motions, he turned off the main power switch, and then proceeded to cut the water supply. As he stood there, looking defiantly at the workers, Walter knew the situation would escalate quickly. But he was ready. He had nothing left to lose. As the conflict continued, the neighborhood began to split. Some residents started to sympathize with Walter, frustrated with the HOA's overreach. Others, however, continued to side with Nancy Whitmore, either out of fear or loyalty to the community's ideal image. The tension between the two sides was palpable, and it was clear that this battle was no longer just about Walter. It was about the very future of the neighborhood. Growing desperate, Nancy called an emergency HOA meeting. Walter knew what that meant. They were planning a retaliation. The whole neighborhood would be there, and Nancy would use the meeting to solidify her grip on power. But Walter had a plan of his own. This time, he wasn't going to let them control the narrative. He was going to expose them for who they truly were. For the next few days, Walter worked tirelessly to gather documents, organize legal papers, and prepare for the showdown that was coming. When the day of the meeting arrived, he was ready. He wasn't going to just sit quietly and let Nancy push him around any longer. This time, he would stand up for himself, for his community, and for everything his father had built. The air in Woodland Pines was thick with tension as the meeting began. Nancy stood at the front of the room, her smile gleaming with confidence as she addressed the residents. Walter could see her enjoying the power she held over everyone. Her grip was firm, and she had carefully cultivated an image of control. But today, that image was about to crumble. "Ladies and gentlemen of Woodland Pines," Nancy began, her voice smooth and commanding. "Thank you for coming to this emergency session. As many of you know, there's been an issue with one of our residents, Mr. Walter Grady. He has repeatedly refused to follow our community's rules, and now, he's crossed the line by failing to pay his fines. We're here today to discuss what comes next." Walter watched as the crowd responded. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. He knew what Nancy was trying to do. She was painting him as the villain, dividing the community. But Walter wasn't going to let that happen. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and the murmurs of conversation died down. All eyes turned toward him. Nancy's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Walter," she began, her voice sharp, "I'm sure you know why we're here. You've had plenty of chances to comply with the HOA's rules, and yet you continue to defy us. If you don't pay your fine immediately, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." Walter didn't respond right away. Instead, he stepped forward, allowing the silence to stretch out before speaking in a calm, steady voice. "You think you've got me cornered," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "You think you know who I am, but you've made a mistake." Nancy raised an eyebrow, clearly confused. "What are you talking about?" Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of legal documents, slamming them onto the table in front of him. "I don't need to pay your fines," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Because I'm the one who owns the entire road that leads into Woodland Pines." The room fell silent. Nancy's face drained of color as she stammered, "What are you talking about?" Walter didn't back down. He laid out the documents one by one, showing the original deeds and land agreements that proved he was the sole owner of the access road leading into the neighborhood. The room buzzed with murmurs of disbelief. Some people were confused, others were angry, but they all knew one thing now: the HOA had been lying to them. Walter turned to the crowd, holding up one of the deeds. "This is the deed to the road that leads into Woodland Pines," he said, his voice steady. "It was passed down to me by my father, who ensured I would always have control over this road. Even when the developers sold the land, the road was mine. The HOA has no claim to it. You've all been using it under the false assumption that it's a public road." Nancy's face turned white as she struggled to grasp what was happening. This can't be true," she whispered. "No mistake," Walter replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm done being bullied by you, Nancy. I've spent years letting you push people around, but not anymore. You've tried to control this whole community, but now you'll learn what happens when you mess with the wrong person." He reached into his bag and pulled out a printed map of Woodland Pines, highlighting the road in question. "You all use this road to get in and out," he said, pointing at the map. "But without my permission, you have no access to it. That means no more fines, no more demands, and no more authority over my property." The crowd began to stir, whispers growing louder. Nancy stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process the truth. The power had shifted, and it was clear that she had lost. Walter's voice grew more forceful as he continued, "I've already contacted my lawyer, and we've filed an injunction against the HOA's actions. From now on, you won't be able to make a single demand without going through me. And as for that fine, consider it null and void. You can take me to court if you want, but trust me, you won't win." A long silence followed as the weight of Walter's words settled on the room. Those who had remained silent up until then began to exchange looks, some expressions darkened with anger, others with shame. The illusion had been shattered, and the truth about Nancy and the HOA was clear for all to see. Nancy, visibly rattled now, tried to regain her composure. "You can't do this," she spat, her voice wavering. "This is outrageous. I've worked tirelessly to uphold the integrity of this neighborhood. Walter shook his head, his calm but resolute demeanor unwavering. "No, Nancy," he replied firmly. "You've worked tirelessly to control it, and that's where you made your mistake. You thought you could bully people into submission, but you misjudged the people of this neighborhood. You misjudged me." The room felt heavy with silence, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Finally, a voice cut through the tension, a woman Walter recognized from down the street. Her name was Mavis, and although she had always been quiet and unaffiliated with the HOA, she had been friendly to him over the years. "Mavis," Nancy said, her voice now shaky, "what are you doing?" Ignoring Nancy completely, Mavis turned toward Walter, offering a nod. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, she began, her voice strong. "I've seen everything that's been happening, Nancy. It's time we all took a stand. I'm with you, Walter." And just like that, the floodgates opened. More residents stood up, one by one, to show their support for Walter. They had had enough of Nancy's tyrannical rule, and they were no longer afraid to voice their opposition. The room erupted into applause, and Nancy stood frozen, stunned and defeated. The tide had turned, and there was no going back. The meeting ended in a stunned silence, but soon the room buzzed with excitement. Neighbors who had once greeted Nancy with polite smiles now turned their backs on her. Some walked out, shaking their heads, while others huddled in small groups, sharing stories of threats, fines, and humiliations they had endured under Nancy's oppressive reign. Walter didn't need to say another word, the documents he presented had done all the talking for him. Seeing Nancy's face, filled with shock and dread, was the sweetest form of vindication he had ever felt. But Walter wasn't finished yet. The very next morning, with the dew still glistening on the grass and the streets still quiet, Walter wasted no time. He posted a large, hand-painted wooden sign at the entrance to the road. The sign read, "Private property, road use temporarily suspended due to liability risk. Access available by request through owner contact, W. Grady." Within hours, chaos erupted. Cars backed up at the main entrance to Woodland Pines. School buses stalled, delivery vans sat idling, and HOA board members found themselves trapped in their driveways. The entire neighborhood had been built on the assumption of unrestricted access, but legally, no one had a claim to the road. Nancy called Walter that afternoon, but her voice was no longer cold or authoritative, it was thin and desperate. "Walter," she said, "we need to talk." "We should have done that months ago," Walter replied calmly. "But now, you'll have to speak through my lawyer." And so, through a tangled web of gritted teeth, furious attorneys, and emergency mediation sessions at the county courthouse, Nancy and the remaining HOA board members were forced to accept the truth. Walter had control now. His demands were clear, firm, and just. He insisted on the immediate cancellation of the $50,000 fine, a full public apology from Nancy Whitmore to be delivered at the next community gathering, her resignation effective immediately, and the dissolution of the current HOA board. He also called for the creation of a new resident-led council with limited powers. At first, Nancy resisted, trying to renegotiate, but the residents, now furious with the HOA's months of overreach and the chaos caused by the road closure, turned on her. She had no choice but to step down, her pride shattered. When the next community meeting took place, it was packed. Lawn chairs spilled into the street. When Nancy stood in front of the crowd with a microphone in hand, she could barely find her voice. The woman who had once towered over others with her threats and rules could now hardly speak. "I apologize to Mr. Grady and to the residents of Woodland Pines for the overreach and unnecessary distress caused under my leadership. Effective today, I resign from the HOA." There was no applause. Just silence. Walter, seated quietly in the corner, gave a respectful nod but didn't stand to gloat. This moment wasn't about triumph, it was about restoring peace to the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, Woodland Pines experienced a rare tranquility. The new community council was formed, without titles or rigid rules, just neighbors helping neighbors. The absurd fines disappeared. People planted flowers without asking for permission, kids rode their bikes freely down the street, and dogs barked happily. No one received a violation notice in the mail. Walter, true to his word, reopened the road. The HOA paid him $1 a year under a formal lease agreement, which he had framed and hung on his wall, right next to his father's old toolbox. It served as a reminder, not of the battle, but of what happens when you stand your ground. He also rebuilt the fence. Not with modern plastic slats or HOA-approved white paint, but with reclaimed cedar wood, just like his father had used. He carved a small inscription into one of the central posts, "Built by my father. Defended by his son." One afternoon, Mavis came by, carrying a basket of peach cobbler. She glanced at the new fence, then at Walter sitting in his rocking chair. "You showed them," she said softly. Walter smiled and sipped his sweet tea. "I didn't have to shout, Mavis. I just had to show them what quiet people can do when they've had enough." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the cicadas sing and the breeze rustle through the trees. The road was peaceful again, not because people were afraid, but because peace had returned. Later that week, the neighborhood kids came over, asking Walter if he could teach them how to build birdhouses like the ones on his porch. He chuckled and led them to the backyard, pulling out tools from the same shed where he once prepared for battle. The road, the fence, the land, they stood as symbols now. Not just of ownership, but of legacy. Of standing up for what you believe in, even when others tell you to give in. Some might think that justice always comes from a courtroom, a badge, or a politician, but in places like Woodland Pines, justice begins with one quiet person saying, "Enough." Walter Grady didn't march. He didn't yell. He didn't seek trouble. He was just a man who believed in legacy, in honesty, and in the land his family had built. But when the HOA crossed that line, trying to strip away his dignity and bulldoze his family's past, they awakened a lion in overalls. This story isn't just about one man or one road. It's about what happens when power turns into pride and rules become weapons. It's about a system that was meant to serve the people, but instead silenced them. Walter didn't just stand up for himself, he stood up for every neighbor who had been too afraid to speak, too tired to fight, or too broken to push back. And the lesson is this: don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't confuse age with surrender. Never assume you can own what someone else has built with their bare hands. The HOA in Woodland Pines forgot that. They forgot that behind every non-compliant fence or unauthorized garden gnome was a real person with stories, memories, and roots deeper than any policy they could impose. They thought they were running the neighborhood, but in truth, they were running it into the ground. Walter didn't seek revenge. He sought balance. And in doing so, he reminded his neighbors, and maybe even all of us, that sometimes the strongest force in a community isn't the one who yells the loudest. It's the one who stands the longest.